Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to compliment both you and Senator Graham on the way you've conducted these hearings, and I want to compliment our witnesses on the extraordinary level of integrity and hard work that you have brought to your jobs of public service during the time that you served our country, and we thank you for that. Judge Freeh, past hearings and interviews of FBI officials suggest that the Bureau, while possessing many skilled and dedicated agents and analysts, were unable to coordinate activities against terrorism. In particular, the approach the Bureau used against organized crime, deadbeat dads, narcotic traffickers did not translate well in its efforts to fight a global enemy. Individual Bureau offices did not appear to coordinate their activities, and headquarters often seemed unable to control them. In addition, the FBI's poor communication infrastructure made it difficult for FBI agents to communicate with each other, let alone with other parts of the intelligence community. Judge, let me just see if I can put it in my own terms. After listening to a lot of testimony, there's a feeling, and I have this feeling, that there's a culture in the FBI, a culture that maybe dates back to Director Hoover all the way through your distinguished tenure as director, that offices don't communicate with one another, that agents within offices don't communicate with one another, that offices don't communicate with Washington, D.C., or with higher-up officials, that there's a mindset, if you will, that takes place within the Bureau that says hold things close and don't be in touch with local law enforcement and don't be in touch with other offices. And I have that feeling after listening to a lot of testimony as a member of this Joint Intelligence Committee. And so, with all due respect to you, sir, I'd like to hear your point of view. Is there a culture in the FBI that dates way, way back that trains agents in the idea that you can collect a lot of information, but hold it close and don't share it? And my idea is that the only way we change that culture, which I believe does exist, is when we recruit 1,000 new agents with the Congress has authorized, and we train these people that this idea of holding things close is nonsense. It's not the way we do our job. And so I appreciate the chance to have you respond to that kind of, I don't know if it's criticism, but idea that's been purported around here. And I know you've read it, and I know you've heard it, and I want to give you a chance to respond to it this afternoon.
Oh, I appreciate that very much. I'd answer your question in two parts. With respect to information technology, again, it was in the portion that I didn't read. The FBI, in terms of its IT infrastructure, its access and ability to use and capacity to do what private industries, many other government agencies have done very well for a long time in organizing data, mining data, communicating data. We have a very inferior system, and I will take partial responsibility for that, obviously, being there the last 8 years, although there's a story there that is pretty well set forth in my statement. On the other issue, which I think is the more pertinent issue, I would respectfully disagree with that. I say that the notion that the FBI, whether it's working in a counterterrorism matter or a criminal matter, has a culture where information is not shared is incorrect, and I think it's dated. It's much like the notion that the FBI and the CIA don't speak to each other. This committee, I think better than any other committee, knows that that's incorrect, that there may be a perception out there that the two agencies did not speak to each other. As Mr. Pilar mentioned, maybe that was true, ironically, during the Cold War, when we should have been speaking to each other more. But that is not the case anymore. The notion that we have a culture that withholds information from our state and local partners is absolutely incorrect. And I would encourage you to speak to the president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. We didn't have 34 joint terrorism task forces throughout the United States because the FBI was not in the business of working with and sharing information with our state and local partners. The Joint Terrorism Task Force in New York dates back to 1980. It is the template of how the FBI, which at one time in its history, which is why I characterize the perception as dated, did not share information. and in many cases was guilty of monopolizing information and not sharing it. But that is a 20-year-old perception, which is not true. You can talk to police chiefs around the country, and maybe more demonstrably, police chiefs around the world. The FBI has a culture and a protocol and a very well-established tradition now with respect to sharing information. And I would encourage you to speak to mayors and chiefs of police and whatnot. Now, going back...
With all due respect, Judge, I have talked to local law enforcement people, and they have told me that there is a disconnect between local offices. I agree with you that if you use the Southern District of New York blueprint, the Rockman blueprint, if you will, where a lot of information was shared, you do get the prosecutions, and there's a lot of information shared. But how do you explain the Arizona memo? How do you explain the idea that there was information out there that never reached the highest levels of our government? How do you explain that other than people weren't communicating with one another?
Well, you're absolutely right. In those particular instances, there was a lack of communication. But you're talking about a culture and a generational gap and hiring new people who understand sharing information. My response to that is ignoring what I think is the routine and the operational capability and history of our agency. We are not an agency, have not been for the last decade, that is in the business of monopolizing and securing information that is routinely disseminated and used by our state and local partners. We have dozens and dozens of safe street task forces around the country. Maybe you should ask some of your mayors and police chiefs about that. Every major city has a safe street FBI task force. Nothing to do with terrorism. They work cold homicides, they work hijacking cases, and they work with state, local, and FBI agents in the same space under the same leadership. So what I'm telling you is that there is an absolute misperception if there is a notion that we have a culture where information is not shared. That wasn't my experience in 8 years. It was my experience in 1975 when I was a new agent reporting to the New York City FBI office, and I was told I wasn't allowed to work with the New York Police Department, which is pretty hard when there's 30,000 of them in the city. But that is a very dated concept and one which is not the reality today.
Well, with all due respect, I would say this. I know that there's communication. I know there's Project Exile Task Force and other task force. But on the issue of terrorism, on the issue of people that are in our country illegally, people who are here to do in our country, I'm not sure that what you're saying really holds true for that aspect of people who are here illegally and want to do in the United States. And I don't think it's been true. And I don't lay all the blame at the Bureau, but certainly Immigration and Naturalization and others probably share responsibility. But when it comes to terrorism and fighting terrorism, with all due respect, Judge, I think there is a disconnect, and there was a disconnect. And I've been told by Director Mueller that, he's correcting that. And I don't say that you and Director Tennant didn't communicate. I'm sure you did. I'm sure you had meetings. And I know that Director Mueller and Director Tennant are meeting on a regular basis now. My point is that there's a feeling out there that this wasn't happening within agency, between offices. Let me just see if I can ask another question, because my...
Well, if I could just respond to that, because I think it's very important, and I, again, commend the chairman for having a public hearing and for you asking this question. You just gave an example, which I'll respond to. You talked about meetings and communications between the directors, the FBI director and the DCI, but the agencies are not communicating. You have to know from your briefings, because I did the briefings myself here, there was a long history over the last several years where CIA officers, FBI agents together went around the world exploiting Hezbollah cells, Al-Qaeda cells. The agent being present so chains of custody could be maintained, so Mary Jo White's prosecutors could use the evidence, and the agency officers present for covert action and intelligence. You can't understand that reality and defend or support a misperception that these agencies were not
How do you
working
explain
together.
the Arizona memo then, Judge?
Well, we can take a single bit of information, we could take the Phoenix memo, we could take other pieces of information. I'm not saying that there weren't gaps or disconnects. I'm not saying that information about two of the hijackers in 2000 didn't make the intersection that it should have made. But, you know, we can talk about particulars, or we can talk about the reality of how things are actually being done. And I think it's instructive to talk about both, but not one in isolation to the other.
Well, let me, you and I disagree on this, and I think we've heard an awful lot of information. And I go back to what I said. If you use the, you know, the Southern New York District blueprint, it's a good blueprint, because I think a lot of communication took place, notwithstanding all the obstacles that, that the former U.S. Attorney mentioned. And I think there have been task force on some issues, but not on terrorism in this country. And I'm sure there are people that traveled all over the world and tried to find terrorist groups, but I'm not sure that was happening here, and I'm not sure the communication was really going on here. And I do think this needs to change. Director Tenet declared in December 1998 that we are at war with Osama bin Laden. Was the FBI on war footing with Al-Qaeda prior to September 11, 2001?
Absolutely. In 1999, not only had we indicted Osama bin Laden twice, he was on our top 10 list. Al-Qaeda was the #1 priority. We had a dedicated unit. We had an ALEC station that was set up with the CIA to work exclusively on those cases. We were indicting people. We were bringing them back to the United States. We were convicting them. We were exploiting intelligence with the agency officers all over the world. There's no question in my mind, but that was a #1 priority.
Ms. White, do you agree at all with my notion that I have stipulated here about the idea that there is a culture within law enforcement at the highest levels not to share I know it didn't happen in the Southern District. I know that. But you've been around and you've... I'm just curious what your idea about this is.
No, I essentially agree with Director Freeh about that. I mean, I think that, again, you know, 25 years ago, I certainly think that was true. I think particularly between federal agencies generally and local agencies, police departments generally, and some of your more veteran police officers kind of harken back to that. I mean, one thing that happened even in New York, where I think the relationships are extraordinary between the FBI and the local authorities. But once 9/11 happened, even there, where the communication was excellent, the conclusion was reached, the erroneous conclusion was there must have been something not shared. I mean, you heard that everywhere. And my response to that in talking to the police officers was, you know, would that there was something to have shared. I mean, it wasn't an absence of sharing. So I think, I do agree with that. I think there is I mean, my own perception of if there's a communication barrier, and this doesn't just apply to the FBI, and it's not cultural really, but one must do better, I think, in all the agencies between the field and headquarters. I mean, I think there are some barriers there. There are also some barriers built in by what I talked about this morning between the intelligence side and the law enforcement side. But I think a lot of the perceptions, particularly in the local agencies, is really a dated one, as Director Freeh says.
Well, I will just tell you this, Judge, that, and Ms. White, we went to New York as a part of a subcommittee, and we heard testimony from the police commissioner and the mayor there, Mayor Giuliani when he was mayor, and also this committee has heard from the chief of police of Baltimore. And it's not really in sync with what you're saying. And I wouldn't be raising this issue if it hadn't been raised here. I'm not trying to raise it to embarrass anyone. I'm not trying to raise it to certainly embarrass you, because you have a distinguished record, Judge. But I do think there's a feeling out there that the culture has to change, that information does have to be shared, and that perhaps it wasn't on the terrorism stuff, not on some of these other issues. I know there are task forces on drugs, on exile, and I know that the offices are working closely with the local police departments on these things. And my son is an assistant U.S. attorney in Las Vegas, and he's on a task force that works with the local police on rounding up people who use guns illegally. So I know, but I'm talking about on the terrorism stuff, and you know, during the time that you were director, and so obviously we have a disagreement on this, and so I guess we'll have to What was the process by which supervisors and special agents in charge were held accountable for adhering to investigative priorities set forth by headquarters?
Well, we have an inspection process which is separate and apart from the administration of the individual programs, such as terrorism and organized crime and white-collar crime. Each of our offices, 56 main divisions, are inspected usually about once a year, every 18 months. And a team of those inspectors who come from a non-operational division review the implementation of the strategic plan with respect to all the component programs, and if a plan is not being performed in the office, if the U.S. Attorney is complaining, if our state and local partners, who are all interviewed during the inspection, raise the very issues that you've raised with me, we take action against whoever needs to be acted against, whether it be a supervisor or a program manager or an SAC. Separate and apart from the inspection process, there is the individual program management. Dale Watson, who you know, who's testified here, was responsible for the counterterrorism programs and had individual supervisors in the 56 offices who were accountable to him for the administration of the plan, the working of cases, and all the other implementation. So it's sort of a dual process. And then over and above that, of course, is the Department of Justice review, Inspector General reviews, oversight by the committee, budgetary reviews, and other layers.
Do special agents in the field enjoy too much autonomy?
Not in my view, they don't. In fact, they're accountable every day, not only to their supervisors, but one of the benefits of a law enforcement agency in a democracy is they are accountable to courts, to judges, to juries, to defense attorneys, to the media. They have absolute transparency, particularly as a case is developed and moved along in the trial process, which is one of the strengths of our agency, that we have this accountability. It also means that our mistakes are always public, which is actually a good thing for an agency with the power of the FBI.
I would like each of you to comment, if you would, on the notion of a blue ribbon commission to look into what happened to 9/11 and to make recommendations, if you would, please. This is my last question because the yellow light is on. But I would appreciate any comments. If you don't feel compelled, I understand, but I know that each of you have been involved in these matters, and if each of you would comment, and if you'd like to go first, Mr. Pillar, and then Judge Freeh, and then Ms. White. Thank you very much for being here, too.
I would welcome the thought of a blue ribbon commission, simply because the whole problem of counterterrorism goes far beyond intelligence, or even beyond intelligence and law enforcement. And there are a host of other things that get into foreign policy, national allocation of resources, that I think a commission with a broad view would be appropriately equipped to address.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think Senator Rudman's remarks, and obviously some of the questions and commentary about the organization of the congressional committees with respect to oversight is an important issue, and that's probably better looked at least in the first go-around, by an independent commission.
I would strongly favor an independent commission, and one that's permanent, frankly. I think this subject of international terrorism and homeland security is not only the most vital subject that we have, but one that's extraordinarily complicated, that I think can't be done in the short run. I think there should be one. I think there should be a permanent independent commission.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.